Hello again! We are here to talk about macromolecules and the four basic macromolecules that make up life. Alright, so let's talk about biological molecules and the four macromolecules. Before we talk about biological macromolecules, I want to go back to the very first lecture that we talked about when we said the hierarchy of life. You remember that? And I asked you, alright, so what are the different components of the hierarchy of life? And it begins with atoms and it ended with biomes. So let's kind of go back to that again. I like to revisit things. Right? I don't like to let things go and kind of forget about them forever. I like to bring them back. So let's kind of go back to that very first part of the hierarchy of life, the atom. So in order for us to talk about biological macromolecules, we have to talk about atoms. And so looking at the periodic table, which is beautifully shown here in many different colors, this is a chart, or a table, I should say, that organizes the atoms in a specific fashion. And all of the atoms that we know to exist are found in this periodic table of elements. And the major atoms that we will discuss in biology over and over and over again are shown here. And today's lecture is really going to focus on these guys right here. So just on those middle, not so much sulfur, but just on these guys. And this is showing that cartoon representation of the atom with the nucleus in the center and the electrons buzzing around the nucleus. A lot of times when we want to represent a particular atom, instead of writing the whole entire word out, like carbon, instead of writing the whole word out, we'll just use the very first letter for that particular atom or that word. And so C for carbon, O for oxygen, N for nitrogen, etc. It just makes things easier for us. And I want to talk about atoms because atoms make up macromolecules, or molecules in general, and then molecules make up those macromolecules. But before we actually go into that, this is a review for many who have taken chemistry, so you can kind of fast forward if it's possible. But I just want to do a review on the types of bonds that can form with each of these macromolecules. There we go. So for nitrogen, 3 bonds. Hydrogen, 1. Oxygen, 2. Probably could do the rest if you remember. Carbon, 4. Okay, so it's 2, 1, 2, 3, 4 in that order. So that means what I'm drawing here is that hydrogen will always form 1 bond with another molecule. Oxygen will always form 2 bonds with another molecule. I mean, there are exceptions to this rule, but for the most part, this is the case. Nitrogen will always form 3, and carbon will form 4. Now, they're forming these bonds because it's unstable by itself, and it needs to bind to another atom in order for it to become more of a stable molecule. So oxygen by itself would be a very dangerous molecule, actually. It's a free radical. It's not happy, it's very unstable by itself, but if it's bound to another oxygen, okay, it's going to actually form a double bond, and that's the oxygen that we breathe. Imagine a situation where I had a bunch of these atoms, and like I had a big pile of hydrogen, I had a big pile of carbon, and a big pile of oxygen. Now normally they would probably bind to each other if they were close enough, they would probably form a bond, but in just the right conditions, these molecules can interact with each other and form a particular molecule, such as glucose. So glucose is made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. What is glucose? Well, glucose is a molecule, right? And what is a molecule? Well, a molecule is many atoms oriented in a specific fashion. And if I had to kind of just give you that, just a cartoon depiction of glucose, just bear with me here, and it equaled this purple molecule here, so just bear with me that glucose, instead of drawing this whole thing out over and over again, I'm just going to use this guy. And so what I'll have is a chain of these glucose molecules. So imagine if I had this chain of glucose molecules that were so large that it weaved all the way in the back and it kind of went all the way back into the abyss and it's gone off the screen, because there's just so many glucose molecules. Now these glucose molecules are bound together by a particular bond, and they form this really long chain of glucose molecules. Now, this particular chain is known as a polymer, and a polymer is a repeating chain of a particular subunit. So it's for example, glucose could be a great example where you're seeing glucose repeating over and over and over again to form a polymer. And this is the very concept of a macromolecule. So you can actually fill in right here, macromolecules, right? Macro. I'm just going to say macro for short. Macro, can't write, but macro means large. So in this case, we're still under the molecule level, we're still under the molecular level, but now we're talking about like a big molecule here. We're not just talking about one individual glucose subunit, we're talking about many of them together, and this can be an extremely large molecule. And it turns out that there are many of these types of biological molecules, but they can all fit into 4 basic categories, and that will be either a carbohydrate, a protein, a lipid, and nucleic acid. So these are polymers. Remember, a polymer is a chain of monomers. And what is a monomer? Well, a monomer is an individual subunit that makes up that particular polymer. One way of thinking about it is if you can imagine a brick wall, and a brick wall has many, many bricks that make up that brick wall. Well, that brick wall could be equivalent to a polymer, but the individual bricks would be equivalent to a monomer. So a monomer is just a repeating unit, or an individual, the smallest unit that is repeated over and over again to make up that macromolecule. So when I say it's repeated, I mean that it's bound, it forms bonds with each other repeatedly. And so the monomer of a carbohydrate is what's called a monosaccharide. Mono because that mono means one. And so it's a single sugar that makes up the monomer of a carbohydrate. And a very classic example would be glucose, is considered to be a monomer. Proteins, the monomer for proteins are amino acids. And we'll talk more about this in the next video. And lipids, unfortunately, don't have a monomer. They don't have a true monomer. It's not really a true polymer because it doesn't have a monomer. And the reason why it doesn't have a monomer is because there's nothing that gets repeated over and over and over again. Instead, it's made up of these 2 components called glycerol and fatty acids. And glycerol and fatty acids make up a lipid, but we don't see repeating unit of glycerol and fatty acids over and over again. Right? It's only just one big mass of fatty acid that make up a lipid. And then the monomer for nucleic acids is the nucleotide. So let's kind of put things into perspective. When we think about carbohydrates, let's be honest, we're thinking about food, right? And it turns out that that's indeed correct because most of the plant material that we consume and we extract energy from is in the form of starch. Proteins are next. So when we think of proteins, it's everything that you can see right now on me and on yourself. That's made up of protein. It's actually 50% of our mass in weight. So proteins make up the very substance, the essence of like our material. And when we think of protein in terms of the food that we eat, we usually are associating that with tissue material or meat. And that's what the steak is representing. The next would be lipids. So we see lipids come in different shapes and forms. Here you see butter and oil. And lipids are delicious, right? Making that ice cream cone that you love, right? Anything that's like chocolate or something that's really fatty would fall into the lipids. And nucleic acids run in 2 different flavors. We have DNA and RNA. And here is showing the DNA because it's a double helix. So if I said to you, okay, well, here we have these macromolecules. They're macro, they're large molecules. Well, how did they become a large molecule? They had to start from somewhere, right? They had to start from one individual monomer in order for it to grow. And that's indeed correct. So this is a picture showing a string of glucose molecules, maybe starch. And if I had wanted to add another glucose to this string, how would I do that? Well, let's kind of zoom in this region here where we see 2 glucose molecules that are interacting with each other will produce something that looks like this. So what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to stop and take a moment and observe these two molecules and note how before the reaction, how these molecules look like, and the after reaction, and note specifically what atoms are missing or maybe added in the reaction. So just take a moment and try to figure that out. So hopefully you did take a moment and look at that. And so here I'm just repeating this again, where we have this molecule now that's being attached to a growing chain of glucose molecules. And what we'll get is something that looks like this. Well, there are atoms in the system here that are being removed. And these atoms are in the form of hydrogen and oxygen, so water. So what we can see here is that a water molecule, so if we look here, the hydrogen here, okay, this one stays put, okay, one OH on this molecule and one hydrogen from this part of this molecule will actually bind and form water. And this oxygen will then attach to this carbon here and form a bond. And so this reaction is called a dehydration reaction. And I think that's pretty easy to remember because whenever we think of things getting whenever we think of that word dehydration, I always think of waters being removed or I'm losing water. And that's exactly what's going on in this system. In this reaction, water is being lost. It's being taken out of the system. Now, if I said, well, this is what happens when we're building a macromolecule, what about when we want to break down a macromolecule? So if you can imagine a situation where we have maybe starch and we want to digest this starch because we're hungry and our body wants to break this down and get energy from it, well, how will it do that? This is the reaction before and this is the reaction after. And so we see this one macromolecule or this one molecule being disassociated with this larger chain. So imagine that this is going on and on and on. And what do you notice? Well, there's now two hydrogens and an oxygen being added into the system. So we have water moving into the system in order for us to break down a macromolecule. Now this is called a hydrolysis reaction. Not a hydration reaction, a hydrolysis reaction. Hydrolysis because the word lysis means to break down, and so we have to actually break down a water molecule, so we disassociating that hydrogen, those oxygen, so that we can add that OH here again and add that hydrogen on this molecule again. So we have water being added into the system whenever we're breaking down macromolecules, and that's called a hydrolysis reaction. And lysis means to break down, so you can also think of it, well, hydrolysis, we're breaking down water when we're breaking down a macromolecule. Okay, and that pretty much sums up the introduction to macromolecules. So things to note, know the four major macromolecules and the monomers associated with each of those macromolecules. Know what a polymer is versus a monomer, and know how to build and break down a macromolecule. Okay, and know the reaction names, obviously. But I hope that was helpful, and until next time.